The wind that night in 1888 was not merely cold. It was a physical weight that pressed against the siding of every house in the valley, testing the nails and searching for the smallest gap to invade. In the established cabins of the settlement, families huddled around cast-iron stoves that glowed cherry red, feeding them precious cords of oak that had taken all summer to chop and stack, yet they still shivered under heavy wool blankets as the indoor temperature hovered barely above freezing. The mercury in the apothecary's outdoor thermometer had plunged past 30 degrees below zero, a temperature where breath turns to ice crystals instantly and unprotected skin dies in minutes. But less than a mile away, on a barren hillside that the locals had deemed useless for farming, a young man named Tobias sat shirtless, sweat beading on his forehead, comfortable enough to work on mending his boots without a single log on a fire. He was not using magic, and he was not suffering from hypothermia-induced delirium. He was sitting inside a structure that defied every architectural convention of the Victorian West, a space that held a steady, sweltering 87 degrees Fahrenheit while a blizzard raged outside. The secret was not in what he burned, but in what he had built, a misunderstood engineering marvel that looked like a grave from the outside but functioned like a massive thermal battery on the inside. Most people in the territory would starve or freeze before they abandoned their traditional four walls and a roof, trapped by the belief that survival required fighting the elements rather than recruiting them. Tobias had cracked a code that the prairie dogs and the ancient peoples knew, but he had refined it with a level of mathematical precision that turned a hole in the ground into a furnace that required no fuel. Before we reveal the exact dimensions and the simple physics principle that allowed him to outlast the winter in comfort while his neighbors burned their furniture to stay alive, take a moment to subscribe if you believe that true survival is about knowledge, not just gear. Join us as we dissect the method that turned a homeless outcast into the warmest man in the territory. Tobias had not set out to become a hermit or an experiment. The life was thrust upon him with the violent slam of a door 3 weeks before the first snow fell. He had turned 18 on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning his stepfather, a hard man with a face like cured leather and a heart to match, had tossed Tobias's bedroll onto the porch. The ultimatum was simple and brutal. The cabin was too small, the winter stores were too thin to feed another mouth, and it was time for the boy to make his own way in a world that offered no handholds. Standing there with nothing but a canvas sack, a spade, and a grand total of $4 to his name, Tobias looked out at the landscape that was about to become his executioner. The problem was not just the lack of shelter. It was the geography itself. This was the high plains, a vast ocean of scrub brush and dirt where trees were as rare as gold nuggets. Building a traditional log cabin was impossible because there were no logs, and buying lumber from the mill in town would cost 50 times what he had in his pocket. For the first few nights, he tried to make do with a lean-to constructed from scavenged fence posts and a tarp. But the cold of the high desert is a predatory thing. It waited for the sun to drop, then sank its teeth into him. He spent those nights shivering so violently his muscles ached the next day, waking up with frost coating his eyebrows and the terrifying realization that he was slowly losing the energy battle. He tried to gather buffalo chips and dried sage for a fire, but they burned fast and cool, offering a fleeting moment of warmth that vanished the second the flame died, leaving him colder than before. The wind cut through his canvas tarp as if it weren't there. He saw the grim arithmetic clearly. He needed calories to stay warm, but he was burning more calories shivering than he could scavenge in food. He was dying, degree by degree, and the town of Oakhaven, with its smoking chimneys and glowing windows, felt like a different planet, one where he was no longer welcome. He knew that if he tried to brave the winter in that lean-to, they would find his frozen body come spring, stiff as a board and covered in snow. The turning point came not from a book, but from a badger. Tobias was huddled against a rocky outcrop, trying to escape the biting wind, when he watched the animal disappear into a hole in the side of a south-facing slope. He noticed something peculiar. The snow around the rim of the badger's hole had melted, not from the sun, which was hidden behind gray clouds, but from the warm air drafting up from the earth itself. He crawled over, desperate enough to envy a rodent, and placed his hand over the opening. The air coming out wasn't hot, but it was warm, humid, and smelling of damp earth, distinct from the biting freeze of the surface. It triggered a memory of his grandfather's root cellar, how the potatoes never froze even when the ground above was rock hard, and how the cellar stayed cool in the blistering heat of July. He realized then that he had been fighting the wrong battle. He had been trying to build a shell to keep the cold out like a coat, but he should have been building a vessel to trap the earth's heat. The ground wasn't a frozen block. It was an insulator, a massive thermal stabilizer that stayed at a constant 55 degrees once you went deep enough. But 55 degrees was still too cold for comfort. He needed a way to boost that baseline temperature, to take the Earth's natural warmth and amplify it without burning a single twig. He looked at the slope of the hill, noting how it faced directly south, catching the low winter sun for almost 8 hours a day. The idea formed in his mind, dangerous and desperate. If he could combine the insulation of the deep earth with the solar gain of the sun, he wouldn't need a stove. He wouldn't need timber. He would need to move tons of dirt, and he would have to do it before the ground froze solid. It was a gamble that would cost him every remaining calorie he had. If he was wrong, he would simply dig his own grave and save the town the trouble. He chose a spot halfway up the ridge, where the drainage was good and the soil was a mix of clay and packed sand, sturdy enough to hold a shape but soft enough to work with a sharpened spade. Tobias marked out a rectangle, not large, but specific, 7 feet wide and 12 feet deep into the hillside. He didn't just dig a hole, he engineered a system. He knew that cold air was heavier than warm air, so he designed the entrance with a crucial feature, a cold sink. He dug a trench 3 feet deeper than the main floor level at the very entrance, creating a trap where the heaviest, coldest air would settle, preventing it from flowing up into the main living space. It was the same principle as water behind a dam. The cold would pool at the bottom, leaving the warm air undisturbed on the upper platform where he would sleep. The labor was grueling. He swung the pickaxe until his hands blistered and bled, wrapping them in strips of his shirt to keep going. He moved nearly 10 tons of earth in 4 days, fueled only by hardtack and adrenaline. He carved the walls smooth, curving the ceiling into a gentle arch to distribute the weight, mimicking the strength of an eggshell. This was critical. A flat roof would collapse under the weight of the snow, but an arch would transfer the load down into the walls, compressing the earth and making it stronger. For the front face, the only part exposed to the air, he scavenged the town dump and found a discarded, cracked window sash and several clear glass whiskey bottles. He didn't have money for glass, so he improvised. He filled the bottles with water and set them into the clay wall like masonry bricks. Water has a high thermal mass, meaning it holds heat well. During the day, the sun would hit the south-facing wall, pass through the window and heat the interior, but it would also heat the water in the bottles. At night, those bottles would release their stored heat slowly back into the room. He was building a machine made of dirt and trash, tuned to the frequency of the sun. As the structure took shape, the people of Oakhaven began to take notice, and their reaction was exactly what one might expect in a community driven by rigid tradition: derision. They saw a boy digging a hole in a hill and assumed madness. The local postmaster, a man named Mercer who prided himself on his sprawling timber home, made it a point to stop his wagon on the road below and shout up to Tobias, "Digging deep enough for a casket, son?" Mercer would laugh, his breath puffing white in the chill air. "Make sure you leave room for a headstone." The men with him would chuckle, shaking their heads at the foolishness of youth. They saw the lack of a chimney as the ultimate proof of failure. To them, heat meant fire and fire meant wood. The idea of warmth without combustion was alien, the raving of a mind snapped by rejection. But not everyone was cruel. Martha, the woman who ran the dry goods store and had known Tobias since he was a child, walked up the hill on the 5th day. She stood at the edge of the excavation, wrapping her shawl tight against the wind. She looked at the strange, angled entrance and the water bottle wall with genuine concern. "Tobias," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly, "you can't live in a hole. The damp will get into your lungs. You'll catch pneumonia before the week is out. The church has a charity fund. It's not much, but it's a room with a stove." She wasn't mocking him. She was terrified for him. She saw the desperation of a boy trying to burrow like an animal, and it broke her heart. But Tobias just leaned on his shovel, wiped the dirt from his face, and shook his head. "I thank you, Martha. he said, his voice raspy from dehydration. "But that stove needs wood I can't buy. This hill is going to work. I just need you to wait and see." He couldn't explain the thermal dynamics to her. Couldn't explain that the dampness she feared would be managed by the ventilation shaft he was currently carving. She left a loaf of stale bread on a rock and walked back down, convinced she had just said goodbye to a dead man. The blizzard that descended on the valley 2 weeks later was not merely a weather event. It was a historical marker, the kind of storm that elders would speak of for decades as the White Death for 3 days and nights. The sky was erased by a swirling curtain of ice that buried fences and drifted against the north sides of cabins until it blocked the windows. In Oak Haven, the situation shifted rapidly from discomfort to a genuine survival emergency. The firewood supply, which had seemed adequate in November, was vanishing at a terrifying rate as residents kept their stoves roaring 24 hours a day just to keep water from freezing in the pitcher. Inside the best-built homes, the temperature hovered in the low 40s, a damp, chilling cold that seeped into the marrow. Families slept in their clothes, huddled together under piles of quilts, waking up with headaches from the smoke that backdrafted down the chimneys whenever the wind gusted. Livestock froze where they stood in the fields, their eyelids sealed shut by ice. The social order began to fray under the pressure. Neighbors hoarded their remaining logs, looking at each other with suspicion rather than community. The arrogance of the town, their belief that with walls and cast iron could conquer the prairie, was being stripped away, layer by layer, by the indifferent cruelty of the wind. Yet, up on the ridge, in the hole that everyone had mocked, the reality was jarringly different. While the wind screamed over the top of the hill at 60 miles an hour, stripping the soil bare, the earth itself remained unmoved. Inside Tobias's shelter, the silence was absolute. The deep earth absorbed the noise just as it absorbed the thermal fluctuations. He had no fire to tend, no smoke to cough from, and no drafts to chase. He sat on his raised sleeping platform, shirtless, reading a tattered almanac by the light of a tallow candle that didn't even flicker. The thermometer he had salvaged, hanging on the clay wall opposite the bottle glass window, did not read 40. It did not read 60. It read a stifling, humid 87 degrees Fahrenheit. The physics of his design had created a runaway greenhouse effect. The low winter sun had poured energy through the glass bottles during the clear days before the storm, charging the thermal mass of the dirt walls, and now, with the door sealed tight and his own body heat adding to the equation in the small, insulated space, the shelter was effectively a kiln. He was not surviving, he was sweating. He actually had to crack the lower ventilation vent to let some cool air in, a luxury that would have made the freezing townspeople down in the valley weep with envy had they known. By the fourth morning, the winds died down, leaving the world suspended in a crystal silence of deep snow and sub-zero air. In town, the mood was grim. A head count was being organized, and the doctor, a weary man named Finch, was making rounds to treat frostbite and hypothermia. Martha, the dry goods store owner, approached the doctor with a heavy face and a shovel in her hand. She had not slept well, haunted by the image of the boy alone on the ridge. "We need to go up," she told Finch, her voice flat with resignation. "He's been up there with no fire for a week. The snow drifted 5 feet deep. We need to bring the body down before the coyotes get to him." Finch nodded, grabbing his medical bag more out of habit than hope, and recruited 2 younger men to pull a sled. The climb was brutal. The snow was powdery and deep, fighting them every step of the way, the cold air burning their lungs. As they crested the ridge, they looked toward the hillside where Tobias had dug his hole. It looked like a mound of snow, indistinguishable from the landscape except for the strange, glinting pattern of the glass bottles, which were now frosted over on the outside. There was no smoke rising, no sign of movement, no footprint. "Poor kid," one of the men muttered, leaning on the sled. "Freezing to death in a hole. What a way to go." Martha wiped a tear from her cheek, her breath pluming in the frigid air. They approached the entrance, which was buried under a drift. The men set to work with shovels, clearing the snow away from the heavy wooden door Tobias had fashioned from reclaimed floorboards. The wood was cold to the touch, frozen solid. Finch stepped forward, ready to do his duty as coroner. He expected the stiffness of death, the pale stillness of a frozen tomb. He reached for the latch, braced himself for the sight of a corpse, and pulled the heavy door open. The reaction was instantaneous and physical, like opening the door of an oven to check a roast. A blast of air, heavy, humid, and smelling of warm earth and living skin, rolled out of the doorway and hit the group in the face. It was so unexpected, so violently contrary to the freezing world they stood in, that the doctor actually stumbled backward, his glasses instantly fogging up with condensation. The men with the sled dropped their shovels, their mouths hanging open in disbelief. From the dark warmth of the interior, a figure emerged, squinting against the blinding glare of the snow. Tobias stood there, wearing nothing but his trousers, a sheen of perspiration on his chest. He looked at the bundled, shivering group, Martha wrapped in 3 shawls, the men with ice in their beards, and he looked confused. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice calm and relaxed. "I heard digging. Thought maybe a badger was at the door," Martha gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, not in horror, but in shock. You're warm," she stammered, peeling off a glove to reach out and touch his arm. His skin was hot. "My God, it's like a sauna in there." The doctor pushed past her, driven by a scientific bewilderment that overrode his manners. He stepped into the shelter, stooping under the archway. He saw the thermometer on the wall. He saw the water bottles glowing with stored light. He felt the dry, stable heat radiating from the very walls. "No fire," Finch whispered, spinning around to look for a hidden stove. "How? It's 30 below zero outside. This breaks the laws of nature." Tobias leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "It obeys the laws, doctor," he said. "It just ignores the customs. The sun heats the mass, the earth holds the heat, and the cold air sinks into the trap by the door. I didn't build a house. I built a battery." The walk back down the mountain that afternoon was the beginning of a revolution. The doctor and the men didn't just carry their shovels. They carried a story that was impossible to dismiss because they had felt the heat on their own faces. They had gone to recover a frozen body and had found a boy living in tropical comfort. The news tore through Oak Haven faster than the blizzard. By evening, the skepticism that had defined the town's attitude toward Tobias had evaporated, replaced by a hungry, desperate curiosity. The postmaster, Mercer, who had mocked the grave most loudly, was the first to knock on Tobias's door the next morning, hat in hand. His own timber house was drafting badly, his woodpile was critical, and his pride was no longer enough to keep him warm. He didn't ask for forgiveness, he asked for dimensions. He wanted to know the depth, the angle of the roof, the ratio of glass to floor space. Tobias didn't turn him away. He didn't gloat. He understood that the cold was the common enemy, and he simply handed Mercer the shovel. "South face," Tobias instructed, pointing to the next ridge over. "Dig past the frost line, and don't skimp on the cold sink, or you'll just be sleeping in a cellar over the next month." The landscape around Oak Haven began to change. It wasn't immediate and it wasn't pretty, but it was functional. Dozens of dugouts and earthships began to pockmark the south-facing slopes. Not everyone succeeded at first. One neighbor dug into a north slope and created a freezer, while another forgot the ventilation shaft and nearly suffocated from stale air. Tobias became the reluctant foreman of the strange new subdivision, walking from site to site, correcting angles, explaining why the thermal mass had to be on the inside of the insulation, teaching them to see the earth not as dirt, but as a stabilizer. The town that had kicked him out was now burrowing into the hills to imitate him. Years later, when the railroad finally came through and brought cheap coal and lumber, most people moved back into above-ground houses, driven by the Victorian desire for appearances. The dugouts were abandoned or turned into root cellars, reclaiming their humble origins. But the lesson of that winter remained burned into the local consciousness. Tobias never moved back to the town proper. He expanded his shelter, adding a greenhouse front that allowed him to grow tomatoes in February, living in a permanent state of abundance while his neighbors struggled with fluctuating fuel prices. He had proven that comfort wasn't about conquering the environment with brute force, but about understanding the subtle, immense power of physics. He died an old man, still warm, still debt-free, leaving behind a structure that required no maintenance and no monthly bill to keep its occupants alive. His story forces us to ask a hard question about our own modern lives, surrounded by thermostats and furnaces that run on money and grid connections. We are fragile because we rely on systems that can break. Tobias relied on the sun and the soil, two things that never send an invoice. If you are the kind of person who sees the value in knowledge that works when the power goes out, who respects the engineering of survival over the comfort of convention, leave a comment below telling us what modern convenience you would trade for a shelter that never freezes.